suitcase. I would call it the case of the suitcases. It's great. Okay, we will take questions after the three sessions because I guess I can assume that many of the themes will be the same, or I think it will be better. I hope I'm right. So let's move to our next. Yeah. Okay, Dr. Julia. Or Julia, let's see, I mean, I don't know if it's German or English anymore. Matveev is a lecturer in German literature and culture at the Department of Hebrew and Comparative Literature and at the Center for German and European Studies, the University of Haifa, which happens to be my university too. Her research includes, among other projects, a project on contemporary migrant literature in Germany, other European German-speaking countries, as well as in Israel. The main focus of her research is on the migrants' mixed, or let's see if I can pronounce it, hybridized identities, the constructions of ethnic, national, and cultural identities, and the concepts of Heimat and exile. Among our publications are articles on Hannah Arendt, Martin Buber, Walter Benjamin, Vladimir Vertlib, and Jenny Aloni. Geni. Well, Jay, let's see. Well, you go there just to tell you my surprise while walking near the memorial for the Jews in Berlin to see that there is a Hannah Arendt street there, which made me think about it, but we can discuss it later. Yeah. Thank you.
Also the paper entitled Vaterjuden, Jews or Gentiles, Vladimir Vertlib and Eva Menasse invite to a dialogue. I've decided to pay attention exclusively to the first part, that is to the reality to which Menasse and Vertlib refer. The term Father Jews, in German Vaterjuden, was first used in 1995 by Katharina Irma Roni-Dressauer, Dutch Jewish scholar, professor of criminology at the University of Nijmegen, novelist and essayist, better known under her pen name, a male pseudonym, Andreas Bonnier. This term refers to patrilinear Jews, whose mothers aren't Jewish, but fathers are, and who are not considered as Jews according to halacha, Jewish law, that only accepts matrilineal descent or requires someone in this situation to undergo a full formal conversion, the Giyur procedure. Another related term used to define the status of these people is hence non-halachic Jews, which means that their Judaism is not legitimate from a halachic perspective. To be sure, different Jewish religious movements in the diaspora, as well as in Israel, such as North American Reform Judaism, European Reform movements, German Reform congregations, and Orthodox authorities, to name only a few, define the status of Father Jews when it comes to the question as to whether to recognize them as full-fledged members of the Jewish people or not, very differently and controversially. American Reform rabbis can cite their movement's historic 1983 resolution establishing that, I quote, if the child is raised exclusively as a Jew and one parent is Jewish, then the child is recognized as a Jew in Reform communities regardless of the gender of the Jewish parent and without a conversion ceremony. At the same time, various American Reform leaders not only emphasize that the father has to educate his child as Jewish. This rule, by the way, is not significant when talking about the child born to a Jewish mother, but also stress the importance of a conversion, which is, in their opinion, intended to give a person who wants to belong to Judaism the status of a legitimate proselyte. In this case, the fact that the mother was a Gentile will be wholly irrelevant. In contrast to North American Reform Judaism, some European Reform movements do not accept members of patrilineal descent. But, for example, the British liberal movement accepts patrilineal descent, but the Jewish Reform movement in Britain does not. The position of the Reform movement in Germany is also ambivalent, especially when it comes to the question what to do with non-halachic Jews from the former Soviet Union, who came to Germany in 1990s. Since the German government's criteria for the recognition of Jewish refugees from the former Soviet Union, the so-called contingent refugees, Kontingentflüchtlinge, developed in 1990, do not follow halachic definition. Rather, children of at least one Jewish parent, regardless of whether the mother or father, are eligible under the program. The German Reform movement accepted likewise this definition. In truth, however, the practice of the German Reform congregations claiming that being a Jew takes a wide variety of forms and that an assimilated lifestyle does not have to mean the end of Jewish identity remains too far from taking over the North American model. Even if the German Reform congregations offer an opportunity to be Jewish to those ex-Soviet Jews who halachically do not qualify, they do not go so far as to admit patrilineals automatically. And even if the fact of being born of a Gentile mother does not play a crucial role here, as Reform Rabbi and Professor Walter Homolka, whom I highly admire, the director of the Abraham Geiger College in Potsdam, the first rabbinical college for non-Orthodox rabbis in Europe, has repeatedly stressed, among other things, also in his book, Not by Birth Alone, published in 1997, nevertheless, other factors such as rejection of religion per se among ex-Soviet Jews and the lack of real knowledge of Jewish tradition or culture or religious practice as a result of the influence of the Soviet ideology and education raised doubts about whether the American Reform model would work here. It is interesting enough to mention here the opinion of Micha Brumling, a professor for pedagogy at the Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main, and well-known German Jewish publicist who deals with recent trends in German society and in inner Jewish development since 1990. His opinion is interesting insofar as he has been involved with religious issues such as the establishment of a reform service in Frankfurt. Answering the question, I quote, could the non-halachic Russian Jewish immigrants be integrated into the Reform communities? Or does the Reform communities have an answer to this problem? End of quote. He explains in an interview in January 2010 that his observations led him to the conclusion that the majority of non-halachic Jews from the former Soviet Union did not educate their children as Jewish. That means they did not practice Jewish religion nor pass it on to following generation. Therefore, he agrees that the American Reform model is probably not applicable here. If we take this argument to its logical end, this means that they still have to be converted. Or as Homolka formulates this in the same interview, they need support in form of religious, cultural, or educational programs to get knowledge of Jewish tradition that will enable them to define themselves more solidly with the Jewish identity. But according to Brumling, if they go if they do become religious, they do not choose a more progressive Jewish religious movement which could more easily recognize them. I quote, they rather tend towards an orthodox form of Judaism, end of quote. Yet stories of Russian non-halachic Jews are more complex when viewed from the immigrants themselves. According to Jeffrey Peck's research, documented in his book Being Jewish in the New Germany, published in 2006, I quote, the Jews from the former Soviet Union were often the victims of blatant anti-Semitism in their homeland, end of quote. Among them the patrilineals, who too, though halachically not Jewish, were not perceived as ordinary Russians and thus as fellow citizens. They felt marginalized and had suffered considerably from discrimination. Many of them claim they are Jewish because in the Soviet Union, Jews were considered a nationality. That is, their Jewishness was based on ethnic rather than religious affiliations and recognized patrilineally. That was marked plainly in as a famous fifth line of their passports, a category that did not distinguish how that Jewishness was determined, patrilineally or matrilineally. This fifth line, or the so-called fifth point, was a mark, I quote from Peck, was a mark that some have compared to the Nazi J stamp in Jewish passport. While some had tried literally to erase their Jewishness from their passport to improve their domestic situation, when the opportunity came to go to Germany as Jews, they did everything they could to reverse the situation by trying literally to have their Jewishness reinscribed in their passports. It was enough to emigrate to Germany, but not enough to allow them to become members of the German Jewish community. Further, after they arrived in Germany, I quote from Peck, they were often regarded as merely using their Jewishness to get out of the Soviet Union for a better life in the West, or using the Jewish community to make the best of a difficult situation, for example, to get social welfare or language instruction, end of quote. The Orthodox authorities in Germany, for their part, reject patrilineal descent. They frame their answer with words like difficult and painful, but ultimately cite halakha as unable to recognize the patrilineal Jews without benefit of conversion. Similarly, the conservative movements follow traditional Jewish law in saying that the most important signifier of Jewishness is being born to a Jewish mother. Moreover, for Orthodox Jews, not all conversions are valid. Conversions under the auspice of a Reform rabbi, which in their opinion do not meet the criteria of Jewish law, will not be accepted. Since Jewish life in Germany is governed religiously mostly by Orthodox law, the World Union of Progressive Jewry, founded in Germany in 1997, still fighting for recognition, that means that Reform converts will not be considered legitimately Jewish by most German Jewish religious organizations and cannot become official members of German Jewish community, Einheitsgemeinde, that maintains orthodoxy and halachic standards. Peck, in his book Being Jewish in the New Germany, tells, for example, one story of an esteemed young Jew who was dismissed from a religious Jewish institution in Berlin when it was discovered that his mother's conversion was not properly Orthodox. End of quote. Obviously, there is far too much controversy and pain in the situation to continue unresolved. In interviews with leading figures of the present-day Jewish population of Germany, conducted in January 2010 at the Potsdam Moses Mendelssohn Center and the Potsdam University, many non-Orthodox representatives of different Jewish communities stressed that the hitherto unresolved question of what should be done for the non-halachic Jews is probably the most difficult question in Jewish life in Germany today. Going back to Brunier, who as early as 1995 has opened up the relative silence surrounding Father Jews while talking about their difficulties in gaining acceptance by Jewish communities in her speech at a Dutch national conference on Jews in hiding during the Holocaust, it must be said that she maintained another highly problematic aspect of this issue, which is especially important for Germany. For in Germany, controversies regarding the status of Father Jews are not only part of religious debates within their complicated internal battles between the Reform movement and the German Jewish community, as I briefly mentioned above, but also part of the Holocaust discourse. As Peck rightly emphasized, the Holocaust continues to cast its shadow over Jewish life in Germany. It plays out in ongoing identity questions about Jewish self-definition, end of quote, and remains a central and unique component of how Jews understand themselves as Jews. Therefore, since the Jewish population in Germany identifies so strongly with the Holocaust, it is not surprising that the issues, which include references to racism, Nazism, Jewish victimhood, and suffering, create serious and highly emotional discussions. Thus, Father Jews, among them those who were born in Germany and during the Holocaust faced various forms of discrimination, and the classified by the Nazis as half-Jews or quarter Jews were often treated in the same way as full Jews, as well as immigrants from the former Soviet Union, who feel a constant necessity to prove that they were victims in order to be recognized as Jewish, even if their Soviet experience was different, albeit also tragically shaped by Stalin's brutal anti-Semitic policies. That is, these two groups struggling for belonging become often a subject of the controversy not only about the uniqueness and comparability of the Holocaust, but also over the questions of who should be included in the German Jewish narrative of Holocaust. Needless to say, the rigid dichotomy of guilty Germans and Jewish victims created both by Germans and Jews makes it very difficult to fit German Father Jews with their experiences and sufferings into the category of Germans. Similarly, it is also not appropriate or fair to exclude them from the opposing category of victims. Similar questions about who they are and where they belong surface repeatedly when it comes to discussions about the immigrants from the former Soviet Union. Many of them had to assume a German Jewish narrative, not a German Jewish narrative of Holocaust victimhood that did not necessarily belong to them in order to be accepted as Jews and to be integrated into their new lives. They are criticized of making simplistic comparisons that link anti-Semitism and racism or the Nazi death camps and Stalinist gulags. Such comparisons are understandably not as nuanced as is necessary for explanation of both similarities and differences between the experience of German Jews and ex-Soviet immigrants. Thus, these immigrants are often accused of playing a game by taking on the victim role, particularly towards the Holocaust. For in fact, their relationship to Nazi Germany is either absent or overshadowed by Stalin's crimes. The Holocaust surely wanes in significance for their identity compared to other Jews in Germany. This controversial, divisive, and politicized discussions surrounding Father Jews still continue. They reflect different sensibilities and different experiences Jews brought to and have in Germany, as well as remind us how local histories shape Jewish identities. Furthermore, this controversy over patrilineal descent reminds us that the identities of Jews and Father Jews, whatever they may feel about the Holocaust, are inextricably linked by the power not only of German Jewish, but also of European, both Eastern and Western Jewish history and memory. Perhaps these discussions is one new avenue for repositioning what constitutes a Jewish identity, or more precisely, what defines the new German Jew different than its pre-war predecessor, as well as what defines a European Jew, a new identity that began to emerge in the age of globalization, which shifts and eliminates borders in Europe. Now we must ask what these discussions means for Father Jews, their children and grandchildren, and for the ways in which these people who are seen to be different from the Jews are regarded. In fact, the Jewishness is still regarded by German Jewish community as a problem. That means that even if they may participate in the community's cultural activities, they may not, for example, be buried in a Jewish cemetery next to their immediate Jewish relatives. The problem is that there is an ancient Jewish custom governing the burial of Jews separately from non-Jews. As Kyv Kaufman, the first Russian Jewish immigrant, was elected in 2003 as the head of the Jewish community in Leipzig, states in an interview in 2009, some rabbis have begun finding halachic solution for families with non-Jewish members. Nevertheless, they recognize that they have got to make certain boundaries. The best thing, in his opinion, would be to have a section for non-Jewish spouses, but this is still an ongoing process. Such a solution, of course, becomes not only a topic of the theological debates, but also a source of resentment among mixed families and children of these families, resulting sometimes in sweeping comparisons with the policy of racial purity in Nazi Germany. We have seen how difficult it is for the Father Jews to be regarded as a full-fledged members of the Jewish community. However, the same could be said of the Germany, especially when talking about Russian-speaking immigrants. Having a Jewish father and a German mother, the Father Jews who are born and living in Germany may feel they are Germans. But Russian-speaking Father Jews may never feel that they are German, even if with a proper passport, because belonging is more than an official piece of paper. Indeed, German citizenship is granted them more easily by German authorities after having developed the liberal immigration policy for immigrants from the former Soviet Union, left then to the Jewish community to integrate the newcomers. Moreover, as Adriana Stern, a German Jewish writer from Köln, from Cologne, and a board member of the liberal Jewish community, states in an interview in 2009, German institutions do not treat the Russian-speaking immigrants, both halachic and non-halachic Jews, in exact the same way as the ethnic Germans who came from the former Soviet Union at the same time. I quote, "The ethnic Germans were at some point considered German and have a completely different financial background. They receive a government stipend to cover their basic needs. They receive pensions that are calculated as if they had always worked in Germany. In her eyes, that is a huge injustice. I do not know," she says, "how many generations the ethnic Germans have been living there in the former Soviet Union, and they are considered German. I think," she continues, "this is one of the main reasons for the glaring racism in Germany. This affects the Jewish immigrants. They receive welfare and pensions, but these are basically restitution payments because they were persecuted as children by the Nazis. This is calculated as a part of their welfare payments." End of quote. In short, it remains to be seen who will take the responsibility for further Jews. Today, they stand in between, never fully accepted neither by Jews nor by Germans. The quandary and confusion about their status are expressed very clearly in the different public, political, and cultural figures' statements mentioned above. However, Bernier was not the only one who understood this quandary and was hoping to find a solution. It is precisely her voice that became central in contemporary public discussions on this topic in Germany, as evidenced, for example, by Ruth Seifert's article in the Jüdische Allgemeine in 2006, that echoes Bernier's speech at the Dutch National Conference, which was held in 1995 in The Hague. It represents how seriously Bernier's arguments are taken in German public sphere. Therefore, we must examine them more closely. By fighting against injustice towards patrilineal Jews, Bernier uses the word "nothing" to describe their status, the word usually used by the Nazis for the half-Jews and quarter Jews, as she explains in her speech at the conference in The Hague. By using this term, she reminds us that such status of the Vaterjuden is the shadow of the Holocaust that left its mark upon a time of more than one generation, and unfortunately will not disappear so easily. For this reason, in an interview in 1997 for De Groene Amsterdammer, she emphasized not only the duty to truth, but also the duty of responsibility. In this regard, she reminds us of the Levitical commandment to love your neighbor as yourself, forgotten in Christian Europe during the Holocaust. This judgment upon Christianity goes on the Western rationalism as well. She argues that, I quote, "Western rationalism leads to an affective and spiritual amputation, resulting in a situation where one no longer wishes to acknowledge evil as something within oneself, and on the contrary projects it onto the other." End of quote. She makes clear that the real danger in the current situation of patrilineals comes from the reason, the great enemy of the spirit in her eyes, which makes us accept the logical concepts and formulations from which we derive our judgments on who was or was not a Jew, without personal decision. For her, Judaism is above all else a religion of doing and of ethical conduct. It is tachlis, she uses here a Hebrew word meaning to bring to a close. It is tachlis, she says, the tangible practice. She suggests that it might be useful not simply, I need 2 minutes. All right. She suggests that it might be useful not simply to stare at what happens to the patrilineal Jews like a spectacle to be contemplated from a box, but to treat their story of forced assimilation, hiding their Jewish identity, displacement, and betrayal, the story full of fears and conflicts and belonging, as our own autobiography. To affirm this attitude in the midst of controversy without relaxing the real seriousness of the contradictions would be, in her opinion, the way in which we can, from time to time, touch on the other's truth or untruth, justice or injustice. If anyone was able to do this, it was Bonnier. Looking back at her own traumatic wartime hiding experience, she tried to look at the stories of other Jews through the lenses of the aggression against Jews she experienced as a child under German occupation. This experience is thematized as early as 1969 in her autobiographical novel, The Boy's Hour, Jungensuhr. This story depicts a Jewish girl from a highly assimilated family who survived World War II while hidden separately from her parents from 1942 to 1945 at more than 15 different addresses in the Nazi-occupied Netherlands, placed in the homes of Christian families. While some of the Dutch had been willing to save the Jews, many more simply didn't care, or were willing to betray them if this proved to be opportune. But even being saved, she didn't feel lucky. Some of the families she stayed with were Protestant and quite religious. Her Dutch rescuers often expected her, a Jew, I quote from the novel, a Jew child, tribal member of the murderers of Christ, end of quote, to leave her old dangerous identity behind, to adopt the new religion, and to become an active member of a new family with different values, which often included a significant degree of Christian anti-Semitism. The confrontation with small-town conservative Protestantism and with prejudice which was directed against Jews resulted in a fear of being Jewish, and brought about an intense psychological crisis in her. So, I can stop right here.
Just a few conclusion lines?
I just would like to conclude with the I wanted to speak about her latest novel, The World is Made of Glass, where she again tells her story. It is a quasi-autobiographical story that can be read as a history of Jewish people, in the course of which Jewish identity has continued to be reinterpreted again and again, generation after generation, adapted to changing circumstances and new issues. And your point is that the final word on what constitutes Jewish identity has not yet been stated. In the epilogue, there is a figure of rabbi. In the epilogue, the rabbi explains also the Jews are commanded to restore the harmony. Here in the world above and below, so we are the only beings in the world able to restore the world. I think she would like to send this message to others readers of this novel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.